Back in America's wild car years, a few models rolled out that were so poorly made and so strange, people still wonder how they ever got approved. These weren't just bad cars, they were the absolute bottom of the barrel, the ones that made drivers laugh, cry, or swear. Here's a quick look at the ultra-worst machines America ever dared to build.
The 1958 Ford Edsel Ranger didn't just disappoint buyers, it arrived in showrooms already carrying the weight of one of the most overhyped launches in American automotive history. Ford had built this car up like it was going to rewrite the entire future of motoring. There were teaser ads, secret previews, huge corporate parties, and breathless promises that the Edsel would be unlike anything the public had ever seen. And in a way it was, just not in the direction Ford hoped. When the sheet came off, people didn't gasp in admiration. They blinked, tilted their heads, and tried to figure out why the grille looked the way it did. That vertical, oval-shaped nose immediately earned nicknames. Some joked it resembled a horse collar. Others said it looked like a sad vacuum cleaner or a mouth frozen mid-gasp. It was an unfortunate first impression that no amount of chrome could fix. The problems didn't stop with styling. Ford tried to innovate with a push-button gear selector mounted in the very center of the steering wheel, the so-called teletouch transmission. It sounded futuristic in brochures, like something a pilot might use. But in real life, it jammed, glitched, and confused drivers who often missed gears at the worst moments. Dealers quietly warned customers to treat it gently, but even gentle treatment didn't help much. Some owners remembered turning the wheel sharply in a parking lot and accidentally brushing the buttons, sending the transmission hunting for another gear while the car was still moving. Build quality on early Edsel Rangers was a shock to buyers who expected Ford-level polish. Doors didn't align, weather stripping peeled after a few weeks, paint sometimes flaked before the car even hit its first snowstorm. Brand new engines leaked oil on showroom floors, and mechanics struggled with parts that didn't quite fit because many Edsels were assembled on overcrowded lines already strained by multiple Ford models. Workers were rushed, confused, and under pressure. The result was a car that felt like it had been built in a hurry, because it had. Performance was another disappointment. On paper, the engines looked promising, but in practice they were thirsty, noisy, and temperamental. Some cars idled roughly, others stalled unpredictably. And because Ford had hyped the Edsel as a premium machine, buyers expected smooth refinement instead of clattering hesitation. These early frustrations turned into sour jokes. Owners told friends they spent more time at the dealer than at home. Mechanics called the Edsel job security on wheels. What made everything worse was timing. The Edsel launched during a sudden economic downturn in late 1957. Families were tightening budgets, and big flashy new cars weren't at the top of their wish lists. Instead of being greeted as the bold next chapter in automotive luxury, the Edsel became an awkward symbol of corporate excess. It wasn't just a failure, it was a public one, a loud one, the kind that newspapers and comedians loved. Late-night hosts made endless jokes at its expense, and car buyers, already skeptical, stayed far away from showrooms. Yet the saddest part of the Ranger's story is how much hope Ford had poured into it. They spent millions building an entire brand around the Edsel, convinced it would stand proudly beside Ford, Mercury, and Lincoln. They gave it a unique logo, its own factories, its own marketing teams. And in the end, despite all that effort, the Edsel became a cautionary tale long before the first model year ended. By 1960, the brand was dead, swept aside quietly and quickly, as if Ford wanted to pretend the whole thing had never happened. But people remember. Older drivers still recall seeing brand new Edsels sitting unsold on lots months after release, dust gathering on their hoods. Some remember the disappointment of neighbors who proudly bought one only to discover they owned what would become the biggest punchline in Detroit. It broke hearts because it promised the future and delivered frustration. It tried to be revolutionary, but instead became a symbol of what happens when hype, timing, and execution all collide in the worst possible way.
The 1976 Chevrolet Chevette was the kind of car that tricked you before it even moved. It sat there in the driveway looking small, simple, and harmless, almost like a friendly appliance on wheels. People bought it because it was cheap, fuel-efficient on paper, and promised to be the no-nonsense answer to the fuel crisis. But the moment you twisted the ignition key and heard that little engine gasp awake, you immediately understood why the Chevette became one of the most joked-about American cars of its time. The tiny four-cylinder didn't just lack power, it actively seemed offended when you asked it to accelerate. The engine buzzed like an angry mosquito trapped inside a tin can, sending vibrations through the seats, the steering wheel, and even the floorboards. Drivers said you could feel the heartbeat of the engine right in your left foot. Getting to 30 miles per hour took patience. Getting to 55 miles per hour took a prayer. And anything above that felt like you were pushing the laws of physics. On long highways, owners joked they could identify a Chevette from a distance just by how slowly it merged, the poor little thing shaking like it was afraid of the wind. The interior was a whole different adventure. The plastics were so fragile that long-term owners almost became material scientists out of necessity. Sunlight alone was enough to crack the dashboard. Some Chevette dashboards literally split down the middle after one summer. Door panels warped, knobs fell off, and vents broke if you breathed on them too hard. People used to say the inside of a Chevette aged faster than the outside of most other cars. The seats were covered in fabric so thin it wore through in a year, and the foam underneath flattened until you could feel the metal springs. On cold mornings, opening the door could result in the handle snapping off like a pretzel. Mechanically, the car became a constant companion, whether you wanted it or not. Carburetors clogged at the slightest hint of bad fuel. Spark plugs fouled easily. Engines overheated without warning. Fuel pumps quit at the worst possible moments, usually in the middle of intersections. The automatic transmissions were slow, confused, and sometimes refused to shift without a strong, stern torque. One owner said his Chevette's transmission felt like a tired employee who wanted to quit every single day. And then there was the steering. Calling it loose was an understatement. The Chevette wandered across the road like a bored dog, sniffing invisible scents. You could hold the wheel straight and still drift into another lane with no explanation. Owners joked that the Chevette didn't follow the road, it just visited it from time to time. Rust loved the Chevette more than its own engineers did. Wheel arches dissolved, floor pans crumbled, rear hatch hinges rusted until the trunk wouldn't stay open. In northern climates, a 5-year-old Chevette looked like it had spent 20 winters outdoors. One mechanic said he once lifted a Chevette on a hoist, and the jack point simply disappeared into a cloud of rust flakes. But the best part of all the Chevette stories came from the people who lived with them. One owner said his Chevette shook so hard at idle that the rearview mirror slowly rotated downward until he could only see his own lap. Another said that when his car reached top speed, an optimistic 65 miles per hour downhill, the whole dashboard rattled like a toolbox being shaken by a child. A third claimed the heater had only 2 modes, chilly and maybe a little less chilly.
And yet, for all of its problems, the Chevette became a strange symbol of its era. It was cheap enough that almost anyone could own it. It was simple enough that backyard mechanics could keep it running with a wrench and hope. And it was forgettable enough that, oddly, people remembered it. Today, when someone spots a Chevette still running, they don't laugh cruelly, they laugh fondly. Because if a 1976 Chevrolet Chevette has survived nearly half a century of shaking, rusting, sputtering, and wandering across roads like a confused puppy, then that little underpowered machine deserves applause. It wasn't a good car, but it became a legend in its own clumsy, stubborn way.
The 1974 Ford Mustang II was the kind of car that walked into the room wearing its grandfather's suit and hoped no one would notice the difference. It tried its best to carry the legendary Mustang name, but the world changed so suddenly in the early 70s that the Mustang II was born in the middle of a crisis, literally and spiritually. The fuel crunch hit America like a hammer, and Ford panicked. So they shrank the Mustang, softened it, lightened it, and in the process stripped away nearly everything that had made the original car a symbol of youth, speed, noise, freedom, and attitude. What rolled out of the factory in 1974 wasn't a stallion anymore. It was more like a confused pony that wasn't sure why everyone expected it to run so fast. The biggest shock for buyers came the moment they turned the key. Gone was the thunderous rumble of a V8, replaced by engines that sounded like they belonged in compact German imports or economy sedans. The base four-cylinder barely produced enough power to move the car up a highway on-ramp without begging for mercy. Even the optional V6, which was supposed to bring back some dignity, rattled and groaned like it was carrying a burden far larger than it was designed for. Owners joked that when you floored the gas pedal, the Mustang II didn't accelerate. It simply got louder until it felt embarrassed and gave up. Driving one revealed a whole new list of disappointments. The suspension was famously soft, so soft that road testers compared it to a nervous couch. Every bump made the car shudder, twist, and complain like old wooden floorboards. At higher speeds, especially on rough pavement, the Mustang II didn't feel planted. It felt like it was questioning your decisions. Hit one good pothole, and the whole car reacted like a person who had just stubbed their toe. The steering was vague, the brakes were unimpressive, and the handling had none of the spirited feel that Mustang fans expected. Instead of a lively sports coupe, it drove more like an economy car wearing a costume. The build quality didn't help its reputation. Rust showed up early, especially around the fenders, door bottoms, and rocker panels. Some owners noticed bubbling paint within the first couple of years. Water leaks were common enough that people joked Ford should have included towels in the glove box. Interior plastics cracked in sunlight, door seals loosened, and the fit and finish often felt rushed. One owner from the 70s said his Mustang II rattled so much at idle that it sounded like someone trapped a jar of coins under the hood. And yet, the saddest part of the Mustang II story wasn't just its flaws, but how high the expectations were. Mustang fans expected excitement, roar, personality, power, the spirit of 1965. What they got in 1974 was a shrunken, fuel-conscious commuter car trying desperately to look sporty. It was like watching a rock star being forced to sing children's songs. People couldn't forget the fact that the Mustang name was still on the badge, and that made the disappointment even deeper. Car enthusiasts still debate whether the Mustang II was the lowest point in the Mustang's entire history. Some say absolutely yes, that it nearly killed the nameplate. Others argue that without the Mustang II, the Mustang might not have survived the oil crisis at all. But even among its defenders, few will claim it was a great car. It was a compromise, a reaction, a cautious bean counters version of a legend. And for thousands of buyers who grew up dreaming of Mustangs and ended up driving this timid little machine, it felt like a broken promise on four wheels. Today, the 1974 Mustang II has a strange place in automotive memory. It's not hated like it once was, but remembered with a mix of humor, pity, and fascination. It stands as proof that even iconic cars can lose their way when times get tough. And it remains one of the rare moments when the mighty Mustang stumbled, unsure of itself, struggling to please everyone and pleasing almost no one.
The 1982 Cadillac Cimarron was one of those cars that entered the world already wearing the burden of disappointment. Cadillac had spent decades building its identity on massive engines, smooth rides, and a level of quiet luxury that made people whisper in showrooms. Then the early 80s arrived, fuel prices climbed, and GM panicked. Executives demanded a small Cadillac to compete with European luxury compacts, but they wanted it done fast, so fast that engineers barely had time to tape the new Cadillac badges onto what was, underneath, a humble Chevrolet Cavalier. The result was a car that felt like an impersonator performing on a grand stage, hoping nobody would look too closely at the hands, the shoes, or the voice. Everyone who stepped into a Cimarron expecting Cadillac elegance got a rude awakening almost immediately. The engine, a modest 1.8-liter four-cylinder, wheezed and strained as if it were dragging a piano behind it. Drivers trying to merge onto the highway often described the experience as praying with your foot on the floor. There was no smooth surge of power, no quiet hum, no sense of refinement. Instead, the Cimarron vibrated under acceleration, sounded uncomfortably loud at high RPMs, and always felt like it was working harder than it should. Cadillac had never built a car this small or this underpowered, and the entire driving experience reminded customers of that fact every time they touched the gas pedal. The transmission didn't make things any better. Early reviewers complained that shifts were slow, sloppy, and unpredictable. The automatic gearboxes had a tendency to slip or hesitate, sometimes jolting the car forward with a tired thump. On steep hills, the Cimarron behaved like it was out of breath, downshifting late and struggling to climb grades that even basic economy cars handled without complaint. Owners joked that it shifted like it needed encouragement, as if the car wanted to give up halfway through the task. The interior was where Cadillac hoped to justify the price tag, and at first glance, it tried. There were leather seats, some extra chrome trim, a padded dash, and a Cadillac crest wherever designers could fit one. But once people settled in, even gently, the illusion dissolved. The plastics rattled at idle, the dashboard creaked on warm days, and door panels flexed like thin sheets of cardboard. Early owners reported that the cabin developed squeaks faster than any Cadillac they'd ever known. One frustrated buyer said the interior sounded like a toolbox rolling down a flight of stairs. For a brand famous for vault-like silence, this was unforgivable. The real outrage came when loyal Cadillac customers, many of whom had been driving the brand for decades, learned the truth. This luxury compact was mechanically almost identical to a Chevrolet Cavalier. Same basic platform, same small engine, same suspension, same bones. They weren't just disappointed, they felt betrayed. People who had traded in their big sedans expecting a new chapter in refined motoring found themselves driving a dressed-up economy car with none of the Cadillac magic. Many marched back to dealerships demanding answers, refunds, or anything that could salvage their pride.
Salespeople reported angry conversations and quiet embarrassment as customers realized they'd paid a premium price for a car that drove, rattled, and aged like a budget commuter. The Cimarron quickly became the automotive symbol of badge engineering gone wrong. Reviewers mocked it, enthusiasts shook their heads, and Cadillac fans pretended it never existed. Even inside GM, executives later admitted the Cimarron was a mistake born of haste. It didn't just fail to meet Cadillac standards, it undermined the brand's image in a way that echoed for years. Today, the 1982 Cadillac Cimarron is remembered as one of the most notorious missteps in American automotive history. It wasn't just a bad car, it was a car that misunderstood everything its own badge stood for. In a lineup of grand, powerful, plush American luxury machines, the Cimarron looked like the forgotten little cousin who showed up wearing an ill-fitting hand-me-down suit and hoped nobody would ask where it came from. It tried to be something it wasn't, and everyone could tell the moment they turned the key.
The 1977 Dodge Aspen was born into an era of high hopes and low budgets, a time when American automakers were scrambling to reinvent themselves after the fuel crisis. On paper, it was supposed to be the car that saved Chrysler. It had the right ingredients, a smaller footprint than the old land yachts, lighter weight, better fuel economy, and clean, modern styling. It was meant to be the family sedan for a new generation. But once these cars rolled onto real streets and into real driveways, the truth came out fast. The Aspen was a fragile machine wearing the mask of stability. It stands today as one of the most memorable automotive disappointments of the 70s. Not because it was slightly flawed, but because nearly every part of the car seemed determined to fail early, loudly, and often. The most infamous problem was the rust, which was so aggressive it felt almost supernatural. Cars in northern states started dissolving during their first winter, but even in dry climates, the Aspen managed to develop rust spots in record time. Stories circulated everywhere. A man in Ohio who claimed he washed the car twice a week, yet still watched the rocker panels disappear. A family in Michigan whose Aspen developed holes in the trunk floor so large that road water sprayed up into the groceries. A dealer in Pennsylvania who discovered rust around the wheel wells on brand new cars still sitting on the showroom floor. Some owners joked that the Aspen must have been built from recycled tin cans, while others said Dodge should have sold it with a free coupon for replacement fenders. Strangers would ask each other in parking lots, "How's your rust?" and then laugh knowingly because everyone knew the answer already. But rust was only the beginning. The Aspen's suspension was so fragile that mechanics practically lived off the repair bills. The front end, in particular, was notoriously weak. Ball joints wore out, control arms bent, bushings cracked and crumbled, and the entire system developed alarming clunks and rattles long before it should have. Some cars showed signs of suspension problems within months of purchase. Drivers often described the Aspen as wobbly or loose, as if the car didn't quite know whether it wanted to go left or right. Others said it felt like the suspension was permanently exhausted, sighing and groaning with every bump, as though the car was protesting the very act of driving. And then there was the stalling, the Aspen's most maddening habit. The car would run fine for a short while, then suddenly sputter, cough, and die right in the middle of an intersection. Owners learned to expect the unexpected. A stall while backing out of the driveway, a stall while stopping for a traffic light, a stall while trying to merge onto the highway. It became normal for Aspen drivers to pump the gas pedal, whisper encouragement, and pray the car would keep running.
Some kept one foot on the brake and one on the accelerator at every red light, terrified of the engine shutting off. Parents remembered driving the kids to school with their hand hovering over the gear selector, ready to slam it into neutral the second the engine stuttered. The stalling was so widespread that people compared the Aspen to a stubborn old mule. Sometimes it moved, sometimes it didn't, and no one knew why. The overheating issues didn't help either. Radiators clogged, thermostats stuck, hoses burst, and water pumps failed. On hot summer days, Aspens could be seen pulled over on the side of the road with steam pouring from under the hood like a teapot about to explode. One owner recalled driving through Arizona and having to stop every 10 miles to pour water into the radiator. Another said his Aspen overheated so often that the car permanently smelled like boiled coolant. Build quality was equally chaotic. Doors didn't line up, dashboards cracked early, weather stripping peeled off and chrome trim loosened and fell away. The interior plastics felt like recycled picnic plates, brittle and thin, turning chalky under sunlight and snapping with barely any pressure. Wind noise was constant, as if the car were struggling to push a small storm cloud out of the way. The panel gaps were legendary, some wide enough to slide a finger through. The ignition switches stuck, window cranks broke, and glove boxes jammed shut. It was the kind of car that made owners suspicious of every new sound, because any noise, even harmless one, might be the start of a new repair bill. Owners who lived through the Aspen years remember them with a mix of humor and frustration. One man said he kept a toolkit in the back seat at all times because he never knew what he'd have to tighten or reattach. Another joked that he got more exercise during his Aspen ownership than he did at the gym, thanks to all the long walks home. People still swap stories about Aspens that wouldn't start unless the owner tapped the carburetor with a screwdriver, or slapped the dashboard, or jiggled the ignition key just right, as if performing some kind of ritual dance to appease the car's temperamental spirit. The tragedy is that the Aspen could have been great. It had a comfortable ride when it worked, decent fuel economy, and a style that looked modern for its time. The platform even had potential to be refined and improved. But Chrysler was in deep financial trouble, and every corner the company cut turned into an eventual flaw for the customer. Rushed development, sloppy assembly lines, cheap materials, and inadequate testing turned what could have been a respectable compact sedan into one of the decade's most notorious failures. Today, the 1977 Dodge Aspen stands as a cautionary tale, a symbol of how badly things can go when a car is built in desperation rather than confidence. It lives on in the memories of those who drove it, memories filled with rust flakes, stalling engines, rattling dashboards, overheated radiators, broken suspension, and long, quiet walks home from the side of the road.
The 1980 Chevrolet Citation arrived with a bold promise, a modern front-wheel drive compact that would define the future for GM. On paper, it was revolutionary, gone with the heavy rear-wheel drive platforms of the 70s. The Citation was lighter, more fuel-efficient, and packed with modern suspension geometry, meant to deliver a smooth, comfortable ride. Dealers showcased it with pride, GM executives touted its innovations, and the public had high hopes for a new kind of American car. But once the Citation hit real roads, reality quickly undercut the hype. What was supposed to be a sleek, reliable compact turned into one of the most notorious automotive disappointments of the early 80s. The problem started almost immediately. The front-wheel drive system, new to many GM engineers at the time, brought CV joints that failed prematurely. Owners reported the joints cracking, snapping, or grinding after just a few thousand miles. Some described the experience as a sudden, sharp clunk when turning corners, a terrifying reminder that the car's mechanical integrity was questionable. Combine that with engines that vibrated at idle so badly that the gear selector rattled in the driver's hand, and the car immediately felt cheap and unrefined. Even a gentle stop at a red light became an exercise in patience and tension, as drivers listened to the shuddering, groaning, and occasional knocking sounds from under the hood. The brakes were another source of consternation. Some Citation owners experienced unpredictable lockups, where pressing the brake pedal would make the car jerk violently or hesitate before responding. The brake system, designed for the new lightweight platform, was inconsistent in its performance, leaving many drivers on edge. A quiet suburban driveway could suddenly feel like a high-stakes test track. Compounding this was the car's suspension, which earned the infamous nickname X-Body Shuffle. Instead of gliding along city streets, the Citation often wobbled and bounced as if it were composed of rubber. At highway speeds, the rear end could oscillate, making the car feel unstable and almost dangerous. Drivers learned to grip the wheel tightly, especially on long straights, unsure if the car would behave predictably from one moment to the next. Reliability issues extended throughout the vehicle. Electrical systems were prone to failure, with dashboard lights flickering or gauges freezing. Water pumps leaked, causing overheating in warmer climates. Interior trim rattled incessantly. Door panels flexed, and even the seats could loosen over time, contributing to an overall feeling of fragility. Owners often joked that it felt like driving a cardboard box with wheels, a polite box perhaps, but one that wouldn't hold together under stress. The combination of mechanical gremlins and poor assembly meant that many early buyers spent far more time at the repair shop than on the road. What made the Citation particularly infamous was that it didn't fail quietly. Every problem was noticeable, often immediate, and impossible to ignore. Unlike some vehicles that quietly underperform, the Citation announced its flaws in the harshest possible ways: shuddering, wobbling, overheating, and grinding. Drivers who had expected a futuristic, smooth, reliable ride were instead treated to a car that made even short trips stressful. Families who purchased it for city commuting quickly grew wary of highway drives. Car enthusiasts mocked the front-wheel drive revolution, while journalists highlighted the growing list of complaints. The press coverage didn't help either. Test drives often ended with anecdotes about steering wander, rear-end oscillation, and CV joint failures, cementing the Citation's reputation as a mechanical headache. Owners of the Citation often describe their experiences with a mix of frustration and dark humor. One recalls having to replace CV joints 3 times before the first year was over, while another joked that the car's suspension made every speed bump feel like an earthquake. A third driver claimed that after a few months, they had memorized every strange sound, every quirk, and every wobble, so that driving the Citation became less about transportation and more about surviving an unpredictable machine. The car became a symbol of what happens when automakers rush innovation without fully understanding the consequences. It was a car that promised the future, but delivered headaches, frustration, and a lesson in patience for everyone unlucky enough to drive one.
The 1973 AMC Gremlin was one of the most unusual American cars of its era, and not just because of its bizarre, chopped-off styling. While other manufacturers were trying to make small cars look sleek or sporty, AMC went in a different direction, creating a vehicle that looked like it had been hurriedly clipped in a cartoonist's sketchbook. The rear end was abruptly truncated, leaving the car with a stubby, awkward appearance that some people found endearing, while others couldn't stop staring in disbelief. But the quirks of the Gremlin weren't limited to its looks. They carried over into the driving experience, making it a car that tested both patience and nerves. The chopped rear created serious weight distribution problems. Unlike a traditional sedan or compact, the Gremlin had too much weight up front and too little over the rear wheels, which made it behave unpredictably on the road. Hitting a pothole, speed bump, or rough patch of pavement often caused the rear end to hop like a startled goat. Owners would find themselves gripping the steering wheel as the car bounced, feeling every jolt transmitted straight into the cabin. Suspension components were under constant stress, and early Gremlin buyers frequently needed repairs to bushings, shocks, and springs just to keep the car drivable. On wet or icy roads, the poor weight balance became a safety concern, with the back end feeling unstable and twitchy during turns. The engines, particularly the six-cylinder options, added another layer of frustration. Though AMC promised reliability and decent power for the era, the engines often overheated during normal driving, especially in warmer climates or during stop-and-go traffic. Cooling systems struggled to keep pace. Radiators leaked, hoses cracked, and water pumps sometimes failed entirely. Drivers learned quickly that even a short summer commute could leave the hood steaming, forcing them to pull over and wait while the temperature gauge inched back to normal. A few owners admitted that they carried spare coolant in the trunk, anticipating that the overheating issue was just a matter of when, not if. Interior quality did little to redeem the Gremlin. Doors squeaked and rattled, sometimes even when closed tightly. The thin plastics on the dashboard and panels warped in the sun, creating persistent rattles and vibrations. Perhaps most notoriously, the fuel gauge was wildly unreliable. Drivers quickly learned that the needle often lied, sometimes reading full when the tank was half empty, or dangerously low when there was still enough fuel to reach the next gas station. Gremlin owners became adept at guessing mileage or keeping a mental map of when refueling was truly necessary, because trusting the gauge could be risky. Despite all its mechanical shortcomings, the Gremlin gained a cult following for its sheer oddity. People joked endlessly about its appearance, calling it a car that someone stopped drawing halfway, a half car, or even the compact that time forgot. The humor was part of its charm, but it didn't change the fact that behind the laughs, it was a car that demanded constant attention. Owners learned to check fluids, tighten doors, and watch engine temperatures like a hawk. The Gremlin was a quirky, unreliable little car that stood out in a sea of mundane sedans. For better or worse, it was unforgettable. In the end, the 1973 AMC Gremlin remains a fascinating case study in American automotive experimentation. It dared to be different, offering a tiny footprint, a low price, and a style that defied convention. But that difference came with a price: unpredictable handling, overheating engines, rattling interiors, and unreliable gauges. For those who survived ownership, the Gremlin became a story worth telling. A reminder that sometimes bold design choices can create both charm and chaos in equal measure.
It wasn't just a car. It was a lesson in patience, humor, and the eccentricity of American small car experimentation in the 1970s.
The 1981 DeLorean DMC-12 was meant to be the pinnacle of futuristic design, a car that could stop traffic not with speed, but with sheer presence. Its brushed stainless steel panels glimmered like a spaceship on Earth. Gull-wing doors rose dramatically, and the wedge-shaped body made it look like it had been plucked straight from a sci-fi comic. On the surface, it was perfect for a world dreaming of the 1980s future, sleek, shiny, and seemingly unstoppable. But underneath that eye-catching exterior, the reality was far less impressive. While everyone marveled at the looks, those who had to live with the DeLorean quickly discovered it was a fragile, frustrating machine. The car's structure, with its heavy stainless steel body mounted on a lightweight fiberglass underbody, created immediate challenges. The V6 engine, sourced from Peugeot Renault Volvo, was underpowered for the car's weight. Instead of delivering thrilling performance, it felt sluggish, especially when fully loaded with passengers or luggage. Drivers often found themselves mashing the gas pedal, hoping for a surge of acceleration, only to be greeted by a slow, labored response that made merging onto highways a tense experience. The manual transmission could be tricky, but the automatic models were far worse, notorious for slipping and delayed engagement. On steep hills or during spirited driving, the gearbox could feel like it was constantly second-guessing the driver's intentions. Mechanical reliability was a constant headache. Early production cars were plagued with electrical gremlins. Lights flickered, gauges gave false readings, and the wiring harnesses sometimes shorted. Owners reported jammed gull-wing doors that refused to open or close smoothly, leaving them stuck halfway and forcing a delicate balancing act to operate them without damage. Water leaks were common, with rain or car washes often leaving the interior damp or the carpets soaked. Small issues like loose trim or squeaky hinges multiplied over time, making the DeLorean feel less like a high-end sports car and more like a temperamental experiment in stainless steel. Cooling and heating were additional pain points. The mid-mounted engine sat in a tightly packed compartment, making airflow a challenge. On warm days or during stop-and-go traffic, the engine often ran hotter than it should, forcing drivers to monitor temperatures constantly. Cabin heating and ventilation were unreliable. The car could be chilly in winter, sweltering in summer, and entirely unpredictable at other times. Owners learned to carry extra coolant, a few rags for leaks, and a toolbox for any roadside adjustments. Even small daily interactions became annoyances. The long, low profile made visibility difficult, particularly in tight city streets or crowded parking lots. Turning radius was limited, and the heavy doors required careful handling to avoid bending or scratching the body. Each drive demanded attention and respect. A casual approach often ended with scuffs, leaks, or minor mechanical frustrations. Many who purchased the DeLorean for its image quickly realized that living with it was an ongoing maintenance battle. It was a car that looked like a star, but behaved like a reluctant understudy in the theater of everyday life. Despite all these shortcomings, the DeLorean still earned its place in automotive lore. People still remember stopping to admire its gleaming stainless steel and upward-opening doors, a sight unlike anything else on the road. It became an icon, but one built almost entirely on appearance. Those who bought one learned quickly that looks came at a price: constant mechanical vigilance, electrical headaches, temperamental doors, and a leisurely, underwhelming engine. It was a car that inspired awe, but tested patience at every turn.
In the end, the 1981 DeLorean DMC-12 serves as a cautionary tale in automotive history. It proved that revolutionary design and futuristic flair can capture imaginations and headlines, but without reliable engineering, the daily experience can be a steady stream of frustration. The DeLorean remains unforgettable, not for its performance or comfort, but for the way it looked, the dreams it inspired, and the headaches it left behind for the brave souls who actually drove it. It was a striking car, a cultural icon, and simultaneously a mechanical disappointment, showing that in the world of automobiles, style can sometimes overshadow substance, with a cost that only the owners fully understood.
The 1975 Bricklin SV-1 was one of those cars that seemed like a dream when you first saw it in magazines or at auto shows. With its dramatic gull-wing doors, wedge-shaped body, and bold, futuristic lines, it looked like something that should have been in a James Bond movie rather than sitting in a suburban driveway. And then there was the promise of safety. Safety Vehicle 1, as the name suggested, with energy-absorbing bumpers and a focus on occupant protection that was way ahead of its time. For buyers, it seemed like the perfect blend of style and innovation. But as soon as real people tried to live with a Bricklin, the dream began to unravel in the most spectacular ways. The acrylic body panels, meant to resist rust and keep the car looking flawless, were heavy, brittle, and prone to cracking. One fender chip could quickly turn into a jagged fracture, spreading across the shiny panels like cracks in ice. Owners reported walking around their new cars, only to find stress fractures forming after normal driving, sometimes from minor bumps or even extreme temperature changes. The panels could warp under heat, leaving gaps or misaligned doors that turned the car into a visual puzzle you couldn't quite close properly. While the stainless steel frame underneath was strong, the body materials constantly demanded care, and maintenance could be maddeningly expensive. The gull-wing doors, the SV-1's most striking feature, were another source of constant frustration. Hinges wore out, struts failed, and many owners discovered early on that the doors could jam halfway open, leaving them trapped inside. There are stories of desperate owners crawling through the rear hatch just to escape their own car, while a single touch on the wrong spot could prevent the door from closing at all. The doors looked like magic on a showroom floor, but in practice, they were temperamental mechanical puzzles, requiring delicate handling and constant adjustments to avoid disaster. Electronics were equally unreliable. Wiring was haphazardly routed, switches were prone to failure, and under the hood, fuses fried themselves with alarming frequency. Lights flickered, gauges went dead at inopportune moments, and the car's complex systems often refused to cooperate, leaving owners wondering if the vehicle would even start that morning. Combine that with an underpowered engine for the car's weight, and the Bricklin often felt like it required constant babysitting just to make it down the street safely. Even basic errands could turn into an ordeal, with owners keeping tools, spare fuses, and coolant within arm's reach at all times. Suspension and drivetrain issues added to the misery. The car was heavier than it looked, and handling was twitchy, especially around corners or on rough roads. Tires wore unevenly, shocks fatigued quickly, and the steering felt imprecise for a car that was supposed to inspire confidence. Overheating became a common complaint, with the engine struggling to cope with the weight of the car and the stress of daily driving. Every system seemed just a little too ambitious for the technology of the time.
Yet, despite all these issues, the Bricklin SV-1 developed a loyal cult following. People admired its audacity, its futuristic styling, and its attempt to combine safety and sports car excitement in a way no other American car of the era tried. Owners would spend hours tinkering with panels, adjusting doors, and rewiring circuits, partly out of necessity and partly because they loved the boldness of the concept. Stories of doors refusing to open, panels cracking, or systems failing became badges of honor among those who actually drove one. The SV-1 was not just a car, it was a test of patience, ingenuity, and dedication. In the end, the 1975 Bricklin SV-1 stands as one of the strangest examples of good intentions colliding with terrible execution. It promised safety, innovation, and show-stopping design, but delivered fragility, constant maintenance, and mechanical headaches. Owners who lived with one remember both the thrill of the doors opening with cinematic flair and the terror of crawling out through the back hatch because the doors refused to cooperate. It is a car that embodies the boldness and eccentricity of 1970s automotive experimentation. A vision of the future that looked incredible, but demanded patience, tools, and a very strong sense of humor to survive.
The 1987 Yugo GV arrived in the United States with the kind of fanfare only a car promising unbeatable affordability could inspire. For families on a budget, first-time buyers, or those simply curious about importing a European minicar, it seemed like a golden opportunity. At first glance, it looked cheerful and compact, a tiny city car that could fit anywhere, park in any tight space, and sip fuel as though it were in perpetual economizer mode. The bright red, green, or silver paintwork promised personality and a sense of fun, and the price tag was irresistible. But as soon as drivers took one home, the illusion began to crumble in spectacular fashion. The Yugo GV was not just a poorly built car. It was a daily exercise in endurance, humor, and disbelief. A vehicle that tested the patience of every owner while somehow becoming infamous enough to earn a permanent place in automotive lore. The engine, a modest four-cylinder unit sourced from Zestava's European designs, could barely move the car efficiently. Even when brand new, it vibrated and shuddered at idle, sending shudders through the entire cabin that made it feel as if the car had a personality all its own. One that was nervous, jittery, and constantly complaining. On cold winter mornings, starting the engine was often a dramatic event. The motor might cough, sputter, and groan for minutes before reluctantly firing, leaving early commuters staring at the dash, willing it to cooperate. The underpowered engine meant uphill drives and highway merging became tense affairs. Many owners discovered that even a mild incline could reduce the Yugo to a crawl, the transmission whining and the exhaust faintly protesting. Overheating was a recurring issue, particularly in hot climates, as the tiny radiator and poorly engineered cooling system struggled to keep temperatures within safe limits. Long-distance trips were often abandoned, replaced by a cautious respect for city streets and short errand drives. Transmission issues were a near-constant source of frustration. Manual gearboxes were rough and imprecise, with gears grinding under normal operation and synchros wearing out surprisingly quickly.
Automatic transmissions, though rare, were almost comically unreliable. Owners reported delays in engagement, sudden slips, and, in some cases, total failure just miles from the dealership. The car demanded constant attention, whether you were shifting, checking the clutch, or coaxing it through stop-and-go traffic. Driving the Yugo was less about moving from point A to point B, and more about managing an unpredictable partner that could betray you at any moment. The build quality, or lack thereof, compounded the sense of unease. Door handles snapped off with minimal force, especially during harsh winters, leaving owners trapped inside or outside their cars. Window regulators jammed, causing frustration in even mild rain, while thin interior plastics rattled, cracked, or fell apart entirely. Rust appeared almost immediately, devouring fenders, wheel arches, and lower panels like a slow-motion disaster. The body panels, light and fragile, lacked durability, so the smallest parking lot scrape could leave a permanent mark. Mechanics often referred to the Yugo GV as a maintenance marathon rather than a car. Every drive required vigilance, every mile brought new potential failures, and every journey had the lurking fear of a breakdown. Electronics were equally unreliable. Gauges frequently gave false readings, lights flickered or failed entirely, and the wiring harnesses seemed to have a mind of their own. Owners became adept at improvising fixes, using zip ties, duct tape, and sheer ingenuity to keep their cars running. Some carried spare fuses, a small toolkit, and even extra engine oil, knowing that the Yugo's temperamental systems might betray them at the most inconvenient moment. Every trip, even for a few blocks, became a small adventure in survival, a constant negotiation between human patience and the car's unpredictable whims. The Yugo GV's handling and safety were equally disheartening. Its tiny dimensions and light weight made it feel skittish on the road. Crosswinds, passing trucks, or even minor potholes could unsettle the car, and the suspension offered little comfort. Brakes were underwhelming, providing minimal feedback and often requiring longer stopping distances than one would expect. The thin metal body offered negligible protection in an accident, earning the car jokes about its safety feature being that it could never reach speeds high enough to be dangerous. On highways, the Yugo seemed perpetually on the edge of instability, while in city traffic, drivers learned to keep distance from larger vehicles that could easily overshadow or push the fragile little frame. Despite all these flaws, the Yugo GV became infamous, and in a strange way, beloved for its absurdity. Owners traded stories of engines catching fire, doors refusing to close, and gauges lying to the point of comedy. Some even relished the challenge, treating every day with the car as a mini-survival game, a test of skill, ingenuity, and endurance. It became a cult object, the ultimate underdog of automotive history, a car so flawed it became legendary. People who lived with a Yugo GV learned patience, humor, and improvisation. They became storytellers, sharing tales of mechanical quirks and relentless small car persistence, turning failures into memories and misadventures into jokes that would last a lifetime. In the end, the 1987 Yugo GV is remembered as one of the most spectacularly ill-fated imports in American automotive history.
It promised affordability, practicality, and European charm, but delivered mechanical fragility, constant repairs, and relentless frustration. Engines shook, transmissions failed, doors jammed, thin metal rusted almost immediately, and electronics rebelled without warning. It was a car that demanded attention, patience, and creativity, teaching every owner that cheap and small came at a cost far beyond the purchase price. Yet, for all its faults, the Yugo GV left an indelible mark, a tiny, trembling, rattling reminder of ambition gone wrong, but also of the enduring human ability to laugh at misfortune. It is remembered not just as a car, but as a phenomenon, a cautionary tale, a punchline, and an unforgettable chapter in the story of automotive experimentation in America.